Welcome, everyone. My name is Dave Bowden, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. The first two presidential nominating events, the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries, have passed, which means that the presidential race has transitioned from the campaigning stage to the vote casting stage, although there's still plenty of campaigning, to be sure. Two more Democratic nominating events are scheduled for this month, including the Nevada caucuses on Saturday and the South Carolina primary on the Saturday after that. And less than 2 weeks away is Super Tuesday. So all of this presents a great opportunity to check in on the presidential race and see how things are shaping up. Since our last webinar before Thanksgiving, we've of course had candidates end their campaigns and one major candidate formally enter the race. And since our last briefing, I think we've had 4 Democratic debates, with 2 more in the next 2 weeks, including one tonight, along with a seemingly never-ending number of polls and fundraising figures. So today we'll be talking about where the race stands in mid-February. And to help me do that, as always, is Emily Aubert, a staff writer on our marquee team here at Ballotpedia. Now, Emily is the primary writer for our daily presidential news briefing, which comes out every weekday, as well as the weekly presidential news briefing newsletter that comes out on Fridays. You will not miss anything if you subscribe to either of these amazing newsletters. So Emily, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you, David. Glad to be here.
All right, so last time we spoke about this race in November, we were discussing the likely entry of former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And a whole lot has happened since then, and the field has been completely reshaped.
Absolutely. And we've actually had 3 defining events take place just over the past few weeks: the Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primary, and the impeachment trial.
That's right. I had even forgotten about the impeachment trial and its impact on what's been going on. So let's start with Iowa. It's been 2 weeks, and it still seems like we're not exactly sure what the final results will be.
Yes, and the final results are still pending, as the Bernie Sanders campaign is expected to request a partial recount in the state. You know, the Iowa caucuses were really a perfect storm of technical and reporting issues on election night. And to understand why Iowa was so complicated, we actually have to look back to the 2016 election and the incredibly close race between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. The candidates in that year were separated by just 4 state delegate equivalents, but Clinton was ultimately awarded 23 national delegates to Sanders' 21.
And I remember that back then there was a pretty decent amount of criticism from Sanders supporters about that whole process.
Yeah, there were questions about the math behind the delegate allocation, inconsistencies in reporting, and even criticism over coin flips that occurred throughout the state to determine who won in a certain precinct. So, in the interest of increased transparency, the Iowa Democratic Party decided that in 2020, it would release 3 sets of results: the number of state delegate equivalents each candidate received. And remember, state delegate equivalents are not actually state delegates to the national convention. They are just estimates of how many delegates a candidate will have at the state convention. The other 2 sets of results were the first vote of caucus goers and the final vote after caucus goers supporting non-viable candidates realigned their vote. And in the past, only the state delegate equivalents were made public.
Yeah, and I remember in the previews that we did in the Brew and in other places, we really tried to emphasize to folks that there would be 3 different sets of numbers coming out. And it was entirely possible that you could have had 3 different candidates claim to be winners based on those results.
Yeah, we certainly expected candidates would highlight one set of results over another. What was not expected was the difficulty in efficiently capturing and recording these more detailed results. So during the Iowa caucuses on February 3rd, precinct chiefs were supposed to use a mobile application developed by a company called Shadow Inc. to tally and report the caucus vote from each precinct to the state party. But precinct chairs were having difficulty downloading and using the app, and these issues were initially attributed to user error, including poor cell phone service or lack of familiarity with the app, but party officials later said that there was a bug in the app preventing proper reporting of the results.
I have to admit, I've been following this stuff for a long time, and it really was an Iowa caucus unlike any that I had seen. And now we did see results eventually. It just took a few days.
Yeah, so results were released in batches beginning the day after the caucuses took place. And by the end of the week, Bernie Sanders led Pete Buttigieg in the popular vote count by approximately 2,500 votes. And Buttigieg led in the state delegate equivalent count. The Iowa Democratic Party has projected the pledged delegate count would be 14 for Buttigieg and 12 for Sanders. It should be noted that the Associated Press has declined to call the race, projecting Buttigieg will receive 13 pledged delegates and Sanders 12. They believe that the final delegate is still up in the air until the recanvass or recount process is completed.
And there were also 3 other presidential candidates who received delegates from the Iowa results. That would be Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, and Amy Klobuchar, right?
Yeah, so Warren came in third with 8 pledged delegates. Biden received 6 and Klobuchar received 1.
Now, one thing that was very interesting about the Iowa caucuses is that we didn't see any candidate actually leave the race and their campaign after those results, which is not always the case. And now you mentioned that there's a recount coming, or likely coming. Where do things stand now?
So both Sanders and Buttigieg requested a partial recanvass of the results. That began on Sunday and ended on Tuesday. Sanders maintained his overall lead in the raw vote total, and Buttigieg's state delegate equivalently decreased to 0.004 percentage points. We're talking less than 1,000th of a percentage point here. So the Sanders campaign announced it would request a recount today.
And Emily, help me out. What is the difference between a recanvass and a recount?
In the recanvass, party officials were auditing the overall numbers reported on caucus math worksheets for a select number of precincts. In a recount, party officials would actually audit all of the individual preference cards submitted by each caucus goer in the precincts selected for the recount. So it's possible for this recount to result in a 13-13 split between Buttigieg and Sanders, but it's also important to keep in mind that Iowa is one of many contests. It represents just 1% of the pledged delegates that will be allocated throughout the entire primary season.
Yes, there are still a lot of delegates to be awarded. It's interesting to see this battle over what in actuality may be a very small number of delegates. That's a great point. All right, coming up next, we have the Nevada caucuses on this coming Saturday. And I've seen some media reports that suggest that maybe there's going to be some similar issues there.
Right, so it's the Nevada Democrats who are holding their caucus on Saturday, and Politico recently reported that insufficient training was provided on the technology volunteers will use to tabulate the results, which includes 2,000 iPads distributed across the state for the purposes of these caucuses. The state party is also using 2 forms of vote reporting, a Google form and a telephone hotline, but there are security concerns about the online form, and as you know, the telephone hotline in Iowa became an issue because it was overloaded with technical questions, caucus reports, and even prank calls.
All right. So early voting has already happened, I think, in Nevada as well. That ran from Saturday to yesterday. Let's pivot a little bit towards New Hampshire, which it was the centennial anniversary of New Hampshire having the first primary in the nation. And it was really kind of a moment for the state to show its orderliness in how it tracked the results, and also its king-making power. Correct?
Right. So I would say there were 2 major stories coming out of New Hampshire. The first is that Bernie Sanders won the popular vote. Buttigieg was right on his heels again, as in Iowa, but that's 2 primaries in a row where Sanders had the most support on the ground. And looking ahead to Nevada, Sanders is leading in the state in recent polls, topping Joe Biden by double-digit margins in polls released this month. It's also important to consider that Nevada is a far more diverse state than either Iowa or New Hampshire. Nearly 1 in 3 Nevadans are Latino, 10% are Black, and roughly 10% are Asian or Pacific Islanders. So we're seeing different constituencies in this state than we did in Iowa and New Hampshire.
Yeah, that will definitely be a very interesting perspective to kind of layer on the results that we already have. You mentioned Joe Biden. At one time, he was a pretty clear frontrunner in quite a few national polls.
Yes, but he knew he was going to underperform in New Hampshire, even blunting expectations during the debate 2 weeks ago by saying he was going to probably take a hit in the state. And he really did. He received about 8% of the vote, failing to cross the 15% threshold to earn a delegate in the Democratic primary. Instead, what we saw was Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar dominating the moderate lane. She rose 8 points over the course of a week after Iowa and a Suffolk University tracking poll, and even outperformed those expectations, bringing in nearly 20% of the vote. The question for both Buttigieg and Klobuchar going forward is if they can continue to hold or strengthen these numbers in more diverse and populous states.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Emily. All right, and the field got a little bit reshaped after New Hampshire. It marked the end of the campaign for 3 Democratic candidates.
Yes, Senator Michael Bennet and Andrew Yang ended their presidential campaigns that night, and former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick also followed suit the next day. We should also note that Joe Walsh, a former congressman from Illinois, ended his campaign for the Republican presidential nomination before New Hampshire.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We've talked all at this point about the Democratic race for the Democratic nomination, but let's take a minute or two to talk about what's going on the Republican side. The last incumbent to face a serious primary challenge as president was President George H.W. Bush, and he defeated political commentator Pat Buchanan in 1992. But it's just so hard for a challenger to an incumbent president to get some traction. So what really is the current state of the Republican race?
Yeah, that's definitely historically been true. And in Iowa, Trump dominated with 97% of the vote. Former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld received just over 1% and did manage to win 1 delegate from that state. New Hampshire was a bit better for Weld on the popular vote front. He received 9% of the vote in that state, but Trump ended up winning all 22 delegates from New Hampshire. Weld says he's not out of the race yet, and he actually received his first major endorsement over the weekend from Vermont's Republican Governor Phil Scott.
And I imagine Trump's campaign strategy obviously is focused primarily on the general election, I assume.
Yes, his campaign did have a presence on the ground in both early nominating states, including more than 80 surrogates in Iowa. But your comment is absolutely right, Dave. This is especially true since the impeachment trial. If you remember, Trump was the 3rd president to be tried in the Senate. He was acquitted of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress just 2 weeks ago. Those votes essentially ran along party lines, except for Mitt Romney. He was the only Republican to vote guilty on the abuse of power charge, making him the first senator in U.S. history to vote to convict a president from his own party in an impeachment trial. But this was certainly a victory for Trump, and he has been heavily leaning into his acquittal on the campaign trail.
And Trump was just in, I guess, Florida for the Daytona 500, right?
Yes, and he's held rallies in battleground states, Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, and New Hampshire, all since the beginning of the year. He actually has a rally in Phoenix tonight and 2 more after that in Colorado and Nevada.
All right, so we made mention at the beginning of the briefing, and now we should probably get into a little bit more detail, and that the one major candidate that we haven't talked about so far is Michael Bloomberg.
Yes, so Bloomberg intentionally skipped the first 4 nominating contests, which is why we haven't really discussed him yet. He has been focused instead on Super Tuesday, where 40% of the US population has a primary event, and 1,357 pledged delegates are at stake. That's about a third of the total pledged delegates.
Yeah, it's going to be huge. Um, the size and scope of Bloomberg's campaign in just a relatively short period of time cannot be underemphasized. Just how big is his campaign right now?
It is huge. He has over 2,400 staffers, and he's making it hard for other campaigns to keep up. The New York Times reported that a field organizer could make $72,000 annually working on Bloomberg's campaign, nearly twice what other campaigns have been offering. And for comparison's sake, Elizabeth Warren has about 1,000 staffers, and Bernie Sanders has 900. So that's a huge difference in the amount of ground power between these candidates. And Bloomberg's team has been on the ground organizing in Super Tuesday states for far longer than most other campaigns who have had to focus their money and operations on Iowa and New Hampshire.
And of course, staffers and ground efforts is only one part of Bloomberg's effort. The other part would be his campaign advertising and spending, right?
Right. So on Facebook alone, for example, he spent about $8 million just this past week. That's $1 million more dollars than the next top 100 advertisers combined over the same time period. More generally, he spent over $400 million on advertising with a particular focus on the Super Tuesday states. It's hard to contextualize just how much that is for an individual self-funding candidate, but he's well on his way to a potentially billion-dollar operation before the general election even begins.
That's really impressive. Is really the only way you can describe it. I mean, it's just such a large number when you think about it. All right, and Bloomberg just qualified for tonight's debate at the last minute, right?
That's right. He'll make his debate stage debut tonight after receiving 19% support in a national poll that was released yesterday. That gave him his fourth and final qualifying poll. 5 other candidates had already qualified to participate: Biden, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Sanders, and Warren. They each received at least one delegate from the Iowa caucuses, which was another way to qualify.
All right, so we've got 6 candidates that'll be at the debate tonight. Who did not make this debate?
Tulsi Gabbard and Tom Steyer. Gabbard couldn't quite cross the 3% mark in any qualifying polls. Steyer did hit 11% in one poll, but he needed 3 more. Gabbard and Steyer will have another shot this month, though. The next Democratic primary debate will take place next Tuesday in Charleston, South Carolina, before that state holds its presidential primary on February 29th.
All right, and I mean, we've got a lot of things happening in these 2 weeks, but I would say everybody's got their eye on what's going to happen at the beginning of next month, which is Super Tuesday. So, Emily, what should we be paying attention to as we approach March 3rd?
So 15 states and territories and the Democrats abroad are holding a primary event on Super Tuesday. The 2 big ones to win are California, which has 415 pledged delegates, and Texas, which has 228. Polls released this month show Sanders and Bloomberg at the top, with Biden, Buttigieg, and Warren on the cusp of the 15% viability threshold we've discussed throughout this webinar. In Texas, we're seeing similar numbers with Sanders, Biden, and Bloomberg leading.
And I know, looking back through history, one way to think about Super Tuesday is looking at the geographic regions that are represented, because there's just so many states. For example, Hillary Clinton did very well in the South in 2016, while Bernie Sanders did much better in the Northwest and was winning states there. Are we seeing any kind of similar patterns this year?
So polling is a bit more limited for those other states right now, but in the Northeast, particularly in Massachusetts and Maine, that's where you might see Warren do a little better and get a few delegates. But across all of the Super Tuesday states, polling suggests that Sanders, Biden, and Bloomberg are the most competitive.
And stepping back a little bit, there's been a lot of media talk about the question of whether any candidate in the Democratic field is going to be able to reach the 1,991 delegates, pledged delegates, necessary to win that party's nomination on the first ballot. How likely is it that a contested convention actually happens?
So 538 has those odds at 2 and 5 right now, making it more likely than a Sanders win, which is at 1 and 3. But this hasn't happened in more than half a century. The last brokered convention occurred in 1952 when Democrats nominated Adlai Stevenson after 3 ballots. We still have 2 debates to come before the end of the month and 2 more primary events, although early voting has started in many Super Tuesday states. I would say that the biggest unknown factor here, as we've discussed, is the Bloomberg effect, and we'll start to see how that will unfold beginning tonight when he makes his first debate appearance.
And I know that traders on the predicted political futures markets are also kind of leaning into the idea that Sanders and Bloomberg are the most competitive. I think Bernie Sanders is trading at 52 cents on the dollar and Bloomberg at 27. So that I don't think that those markets have been around for a long time. It'll be interesting to see how predictive they really are. Thank you so much, Emily, for this in-depth look at where we stand right now in the presidential race.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I know I say this quite a bit, but if you want a fantastic way to stay informed about the race for the White House, I definitely recommend signing up for either of the two free email newsletters I mentioned before, and that's the Daily Presidential News Briefing or the Weekly Presidential News Briefing. They're thorough, they're a great read, they'll arrive straight to your email inbox. And as we've discussed, there are quite a few important events happening just in the next several days. It starts with tonight's presidential debate from Las Vegas. There's also the Nevada Democratic Caucus on Saturday. There's another debate next week. The South Carolina primaries are the Saturday after that. And we'll be covering all of these events on our site and in our newsletters. And of course, the rest of the political world is still active as well. And in order to stay in the know on all the things going on in the political world, you will want to consider subscribing to our other email newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly newsletter, The Tap. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching.